Hey, is this thing on? All right, it's Rutherford here. We want to give you a lecture today about water, but really it's about life, like the origins of life, how we have life, and why it has to do with water, okay? And it really has to do with what dissolves in water and what doesn't dissolve in water. The things that are solved by water, things that dissolve in water, things like salt is a really common one. We got sodium chloride over here. The reason that sodium chloride dissolves in water is because it's part positive and part negative. And the reason that water can dissolve is because water is part negative and part positive. So the negative part of water can pull onto anything that's positive because opposites attract. The positive part of water can pull on anything that's negative because opposites attract. So anything that has any charge at all can be ripped apart by water, pulled apart by water. Bonds can be broken. This is solving it, just like a math problem. We called it dissolving it, okay? And we have another word, soluble. So salt is one of those things that's soluble by water because we have sodium and chloride. The sodium's positive, the chlorine's negative. So the positive parts of the water, which is the hydrogen side, is going to pull on the chlorine. And the negative parts of water are going to pull on, which are oxygen. The oxygens of the waters are going to pull on the sodium, and it's going to rip that apart. It's going to solve salt. And that's how we break that down, right? Okay? And most things break down in water, but there are some things that don't break down in water. We got oil, okay? We did this with our experiment today. Oil is something that doesn't break down in water. Another word for oil is fat. Another word for fat is lipids inside your body. So we got oils, fats, lipids, things that don't break down in water. Now, our favorite lipid is the phospholipid. Our phospholipid is part phosphate, part lipid. The phosphate part is the head, and the lipid tails are the other part. There are two lipid tails for every one phosphate head. And because the lipid tails are lipids, which are fats, which are oils, which don't like water, they are hydrophobic. They are uncharged. They are nonpolar. They do not have a charge. They are not positive. They are not negative. They are neutral. And therefore, they do not like to react with water. Water cannot solve them. Water is positive and negative, looking for things that are negative and positive. Water likes things that are charged, hydrophilic, polar. Water can solve those things, like salt, like the phosphate head. And water likes to hang out with those things. However, the lipid part, the lipid tails of the phospholipid do not like water, and they will not dissolve in water. So we can form a cell membrane. Because the phosphate heads like water, they all line up to hang out with the water outside of the cell. And the phosphate heads will also line up on the inside of the cell because they like water. Because your cells are filled with water. We're 70% water. And we got water outside the cells. That's the bath that waters are sitting in, right? And blood, which is mostly water. And inside the cells, mostly water. There's other stuff dissolved in it, but it's mostly water. So you have phosphate heads interacting with and touching and enjoying the hydrophilia, the charged polarity of the water on the inside and outside. And what's not touching the water? The lipid tails. These lipid tails on the inside. And because of that, we form this bubble, this circle, okay, that separates the inside from the outside. And that's where life comes from. If we can separate, if we can create a barrier, if we have a filter, we can say, look, certain things stay out, certain things stay inside. All the stuff inside, it can work together, it can bounce around, it can interact together. It's kind of like having a classroom or having a house. And the things that are outside, those things are outside. We choose what gets to come in. That's called semi-permeable. We filter what goes out. That would be waste or other things that we don't need. And that's the way that we have life. It's the only existence of life. And one of the most important things about life is having work be done. Work is done by proteins. Working proteins are called enzymes. The enzymes are powered by ATP. And where do we get that ATP? From the mitochondria, if you're a eukaryote. Eukaryotes have a mitochondria. They call us the powerhouse of the cell. I hate that phrase. The mitochondria actually makes ATP. Okay? It is a little molecule that goes and attaches to an enzyme, and then that enzyme can do some work. Okay? And then as soon as it does that work, we need to charge up more ATP to do more work. Depends on how many times you need to make that motion as a working protein enzyme. Now, where does the mitochondria get the energy to charge up ATP? That comes from your food. Food gets digested and then goes into the bloodstream. And then from the bloodstream, it has to diffuse into your cell. This can be carbs, fat, sugar. And this diffuses into the cell, gets to the mitochondria. And the mitochondria is going to be able to charge up ATP. But it needs something, and that's oxygen. So you need to breathe and get oxygen into your lungs so that it diffuses into your bloodstream. And then from your bloodstream, it's going to go out to the rest of your body, and it will diffuse from the bloodstream into your cells. If there is a higher concentration outside and then a lower concentration inside, then that oxygen will be able to come in. That movement is called diffusion, and it goes from high to low to equilibrium. Okay, it's going to try and balance out. If there's a lot of stuff over here and just a little stuff over here, it's going to balance out at equilibrium. That's the definition of diffusion. So oxygen is going to do that because there's more oxygen in the blood than in your cells. Then, when your mitochondria uses the oxygen, there's always going to be less oxygen here because the mitochondria is using the oxygen in order to charge up ATP through a process known as cellular respiration, which we will do later. Now, one of the waste products of that process is called CO2. CO2, of course, we need to exhale. Now, it's going to build up in your cells because you're making it with the mitochondria as a waste product. Then it needs to diffuse out, and it goes back into the bloodstream, and your blood is going to carry back to the lungs. It's going to come out of the blood into the lungs, and then you can exhale it. But it's also still moving from high to low. We have to go from high to low to equilibrium. That's our diffusion. Okay? Something else that's going to travel through our blood that needs to go in and out of our cells is water. Okay, so water is going to go back and forth to make sure there's a nice balance and everything's good in your cells because your cells need a certain amount of water. They don't want to have too much, they'll explode. They don't want to have too little, they'll shrivel up. And so the movement of water, though, since water is so important, is called osmosis. Okay, now I know you're saying, wait a minute, how is water moving through those lipid tails? They don't like water. They're hydrophobic. I know. It goes really fast, okay? And it's not a ton of water that goes through there. In fact, if a ton of water goes through, that could break the cell, right? Okay, which is why overhydration can. So the movement of water, though, is a type of diffusion called osmosis. And it still has to go from high to low. But because water is so important, it has its own name. It's called osmosis. Okay, now let's review the very, very last thing. I did say the mitochondria are only in eukaryotes. And the eukaryotes, which is plants, animals, and fungi, have a nucleus. And so the nucleus of the eukaryotes, the plants, animals, and fungi, is really what defines the eukaryotes in contrast to the prokaryotes. The prokaryotes are bacteria. Now, that's the main difference. There's a lot of other similarities there. They still make proteins. They still got DNA, mRNA, ATP, so they do transcription, translation. They make proteins out of amino acids, and of course they have a ribosome in order to make the proteins. Now, yes, the ribosome can be slightly different. The DNA can be in a different format, but there's a ton of similarities between these two living things, which of course is because we evolved similarly. Okay, I think I got it all. Thank you for joining me. Maybe I should talk about those weak hydrogen bonds. So the other thing about water is that water can bond to itself. Not only can water bond to something like salt, that would be adhesion. When water sticks to the wall, a window, a leaf, before dropping off, it's holding on, it's sticking, that's adhesion. With the salt here, because salt's charged, adhesion. But water can also stick to itself. That's called cohesion. Because water molecules are both positive and negative, if you bring another water molecule in here, the positive part of one is going to want to be next to the negative of the other. And then this positive part is going to want to touch the negative part of another. So together they can all kind of get together and form a grouping, right? And that's called cohesion. And you're going to form hydrogen bonds there. And that's what gives us surface tension. That's why belly flops hurt so much. And that's the last part. Thanks.